The Galactic Military Academy's emergency sirens echoed through the crystalline corridors of Station Nexus 7, their piercing wails cutting through the usual hum of daily activities. Commander's forearms moved frantically across his command console, his chitinous exoskeleton clicking with nervous energy as he processed the incoming data streams. The situation reports flooding his screens painted a picture so dire that his species' natural pessimism seemed almost optimistic in comparison. "Sir, we've lost contact with 17 Outer Rim colonies in the past 72 hours, Lieutenant Ra reported, her translucent blue skin flickering with distress patterns. "The hegemony forces are advancing faster than our worst-case projections." His mandibles clacked together in what other species had learned to recognize as deep concern. The hegemony had been a theoretical threat for decades, a coalition of aggressive species from the galaxy's dark sectors who viewed the peaceful Galactic Federation as weakness incarnate. Their recent emergence from behind their nebular barriers had caught everyone off guard, and their technology proved surprisingly advanced. "How many active duty personnel do we have available for immediate deployment?" asked, though he already suspected the answer would be insufficient. "Barely 300,000, scattered across 47 sectors, came the reply from his tactical officer. "Most of our veterans are already engaged in holding actions at the defense line." The commander's lower set of arms drummed against his desk, a nervous habit that had only developed since taking this position. The academy housed over 2 million cadets from 600 different species, all in various stages of their military training. Most had never seen real combat, and the thought of throwing them against the hegemony forces felt like sending younglings into a star's corona. "Sir," another voice interrupted his brooding. "Emergency communication from High Command." The holographic projector flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Fleet Admiral Eth, whose species had evolved from apex predators on a world where everything bigger wanted to eat you, and everything smaller wanted to poison you. Even among the Federation's most hardened warriors, Eth commanded respect through sheer presence alone. The Admiral began without preamble. "I'm authorizing Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha. Deploy every cadet with at least 6 months of training to 438B immediately." The commander felt his primary heart skip several beats. 438B was classified as a Class 3, a planet where the environment itself was actively hostile to most known forms of life. The Federation had established a research outpost there precisely because the conditions were so extreme that no enemy would consider it a strategic target. "Admiral, with respect, most of our cadets have never even been on a Class 1 world, let alone." "I understand your concerns, Commander, but we're out of options. The hegemony has broken through at 3 points along the line. We need every warm body we can get, and we need them there yesterday." Eth's image leaned forward slightly. "The research station has been converted into a forward operating base. It's the only defensible position in that sector." His tactical mind immediately began cataloging the numerous ways this plan could result in catastrophic casualties. The atmospheric pressure alone on 438B was enough to crush most species' respiratory systems. The temperature fluctuations could freeze methane one moment and vaporize titanium the next. The local fauna included creatures that made Eths look like a petting zoo. "Sir, perhaps if we selected only the cadets from the more resilient species." "Every cadet, that's an order." The Admiral's expression softened slightly. "Look, I know it sounds like sending lambs to slaughter, but our intelligence suggests the hegemony won't expect any significant force on us. It might buy us the time we need to regroup and counterattack." The communication ended, leaving staring at the Academy roster scrolling across his screen. Species after species flashed by, the graceful Etherians with their gossamer wings that would snap in 438B's violent windstorms, the aquatic depth swimmers who required specialized environmental suits just to function in standard atmospheric conditions, the crystalline resonance whose very molecular structure would destabilize in the planet's magnetic field fluctuations. His aide, a young whose plant-like physiology gave her natural empathy abilities, approached cautiously. "Commander, shall I begin the general mobilization announcement?" In a moment, pulled up the detailed environmental reports from 438B, hopping against hope that the conditions had somehow improved since the last survey. They had not. If anything, the approaching solar storm season would make conditions even worse. The roster continued scrolling, and then something caught his attention. Near the end of the list, in a section he rarely paid attention to, was a single entry that made him pause. Adams Jake Species, Human Classification, Earth, Class 3 Current Status, Active Cadet Advanced Combat Training. His upper arms stopped their nervous drumming. In all his years at the academy, he had encountered exactly 3 humans, and each one had left a distinct impression. There was something about their species, that conventional military doctrine. While other species compensated for their hostile environments by developing specialized survival traits, harder shells, toxic resistance, enhanced senses, humans seem to have developed the most dangerous adaptation of all, the ability to find entertainment in situations that should have killed them. He accessed the human's file with growing interest. Jake Adams, age 22 standard years, from a continent called North America on the human. His academic records were solid but unremarkable. His physical performance scores, however, were consistently in the top percentile across all categories that mattered for survival. Endurance, adaptability, stress tolerance, and something the testing protocols labeled as hostile environment enthusiasm, which had always assumed was a translation error. The most interesting part of Adams' file was his personal statement from his academy application. Looking forward to seeing what the galaxy considers challenging. My average temperature is 40 degrees below the Federation standard. We have storms that can level buildings every few months, and the local wildlife includes bears, wolves, and something called a moose that even other humans are afraid of. I figure military training will be a nice change of pace. His mandibles spread in what might have been amusement if his species were capable of such frivolity. He pulled up Earth's classification data and immediately understood why the Federation had been so selective in their recruitment from that world. Earth was listed as a Class 3 for extreme weather variability, abundant megafauna, hostile microorganism diversity, geological instability, and atmospheric composition borderline toxic to most galactic life forms. The environmental summary was particularly enlightening. Human experiences temperature ranges from -80 to +60 degrees Celsius, depending on seasonal and geographical variables. Atmospheric pressure and composition require adaptation protocols for most Federation species. Local gravity 1.3 times galactic standard. Notable hazards include, but are not limited to, massive atmospheric disturbances capable of sustained winds over 300 kilometers per hour, seismic events measuring up to 9.5 on the scale, volcanic activity, radiation exposure from local star, and an ecosystem that has produced creatures capable of crushing standard Federation power armor. At the bottom of the report, some long ago had added a note. Recommend extreme caution when interacting with humans in stress situations. Species demonstrates alarming tendency to interpret life-threatening scenarios as recreational opportunities. Further study needed to determine if this is cultural adaptation or genetic predisposition. Cleared her throat with a sound like rustling leaves. Commander, the cadets are beginning to gather in the main assembly hall. They're aware something significant is happening. Looked up from the human's file and made a decision that would either be remembered as desperate genius or catastrophic judgment. Send a priority message to Cadet Adams. I want to see him immediately before the general briefing. 20 minutes later, Jake Adams walked into his office with the casual stride of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle with sufficient application of stubbornness and creative problem-solving. At just over 6 feet tall, he was average for his species, but towered over most Federation citizens. His brown hair looked like he had been running his hands through it, and his uniform bore the subtle signs of someone who spent more time in practical training than parade preparation. Cadet Adams reporting, sir, Jake said, snapping to attention with the kind of precision that suggested competence rather than obsessive attention to protocol. At ease, Adams. Tell me, what do you know about 438B? Jake's expression shifted slightly, taking on the focused look had learned to associate with humans processing tactical information. Class 3, sir. Hostile atmosphere, extreme temperature variations, dangerous local fauna. The Federation maintains a research station there because the conditions are too harsh for most species to consider it worth conquering. And what's your assessment of deploying academy cadets to such an environment? The human was quiet for several seconds and could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. When Jake finally spoke, His voice carried the kind of measured confidence that suggested he had been thinking about this exact scenario for some time. Honestly, sir, for most of the cadets, it would be a death sentence. The Etherians can't handle the atmospheric pressure, the depth swimmers would need constant life support, and the crystalline species would destabilize in the magnetic field fluctuations. Jake paused, then added, "But that's assuming you're trying to make them function like they would on a Class 1 world." Explain. The thing about, sir, is that everything wants to kill you all the time anyway. So you don't fight the environment, you use it. The hegemony forces won't expect anyone to be there because they're thinking like rational military strategists. They're not thinking like someone who grew up where the weather has personal grudges and the local wildlife considers you a light snack. Found himself leaning forward despite himself. And you believe human military doctrine could be adapted for this scenario? Jake's grin was the kind of expression that had made first contact specialists nervous for decades. Sir, I don't think you understand what human military doctrine actually is. It's not about having the best equipment or the most advanced technology. It's about taking whatever situation you're in and making it worse for the other guy than it is for you. The commander's lower arms began their nervous drumming again. Adams, in approximately 30 minutes, I'm going to announce to 2 million cadets that they're being deployed to one of the most hostile environments in known space, with minimal preparation time, to face an enemy force that has already defeated our veteran units. Most of them are going to panic. Yes, sir, probably. What would be your recommendation for managing that level of fear and chaos? Jake was quiet again, but this time could see something different in his expression, not calculation, but something that looked almost like anticipation. Permission to speak freely, sir. Granted. The thing about humans, sir, is that we don't really distinguish between dangerous and interesting. When you tell us something is impossible or deadly, we start figuring out how to do it anyway, usually while making it look easy. Jake's grin widened. And when you give us a whole planet that's actively trying to kill us, plus an enemy that doesn't think we belong there, well, that sounds like the kind of challenge we signed up for when we joined the academy. His mandibles clicked together rapidly, a sign of either extreme stress or the beginning of a plan so desperate it might actually work. Adams, how would you feel about being my liaison with the other cadets during this briefing? I'd be honored, sir, but I should probably warn you, humans have a tendency to get excited about exactly the kind of situation that terrifies everyone else. As if summoned by their conversation, his voice came through the comm system. Commander, the assembly hall is at full capacity. All cadets are present and accounted for. Stood, his forearms gathering the deployment orders and environmental briefings that would either save the Federation or get 2 million young beings killed in the most inhospitable place imaginable. As he walked toward the door, Jake fell into step beside him. Adams, one more question. When you read about 438B's conditions, the pressure variations, the temperature extremes, the hostile fauna, what was your first thought? Jake considered this for a moment, then looked at the commander with an expression that was equal parts determination and barely contained enthusiasm. Honestly, sir, it sounds like camping season back home, except with better odds of survival and more interesting things to shoot at. For the first time since receiving the deployment orders, allowed himself to feel something that might have been optimism. It was probably misplaced, possibly catastrophic. But as he walked toward the assembly hall where 2 million cadets waited to learn their fate, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the hegemony had no idea what they were about to face. The massive assembly hall of the Galactic Military Academy had been designed to inspire awe and discipline in equal measure. Its soaring crystal arches caught and refracted light from the station's artificial star, creating rainbow patterns that danced across the assembled multitude of cadets. On any normal day, the sight of so many different species gathered together represented the Federation's greatest achievement: unity through diversity, strength through cooperation. Today, it looked like a gathering of sacrificial offerings. Took his position at the central podium, his four arms working the controls that would transmit his voice to every corner of the massive space. 2 million faces looked up at him, some curious, some nervous, many already sensing that their training was about to become much more real than they had anticipated. Cadets of the Galactic Military Academy, began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic system. 72 hours ago, the hegemony launched a coordinated assault on our outer rim territories. They have broken through our primary defense lines and are advancing toward core Federation worlds. A ripple of movement passed through the assembled cadets like a wave through water. The chittering of nervous mixed with the melodic humming of distressed Etherians and the low rumbling of concerned species, waited for the initial shock to settle before continuing. In response to this crisis, High Command has authorized Emergency Protocol 77 Alpha. Every cadet with at least 6 months of training will be deployed immediately to establish a forward operating base on 438B. The silence that followed was profound and deeply unsettling. Could see the exact moment when various species databases provided them with information about their destination. The Etherians' wings began to flutter uncontrollably. The aquatic species started making the clicking sounds that indicated extreme distress. Even the usually stoic cadets showed visible signs of concern. "I'm not going to lie to you," continued, deciding that honesty was the only policy that wouldn't get him court-martialed posthumously. 438B is a Class 3. The conditions there will challenge every aspect of your training. The environment is hostile, the local fauna is dangerous, and the hegemony forces won't expect us to be there precisely because most rational military strategists would consider deployment to such a world tantamount to suicide. The silence was becoming oppressive. Could feel the weight of 2 million beings processing their potential doom, and he began to understand why command positions carried such high mortality rates from stress-related disorders. Then, from somewhere in the human section, because of course the humans had ended up clustering together, came a voice that cut through the silence like a plasma blade through butter. "Sir, does the planet have any particularly interesting weather patterns?" His enhanced hearing identified the speaker as Adams, and he found himself grateful for the interruption. "Yes, Cadet Adams. 438B experiences atmospheric disturbances that can generate sustained winds exceeding 400 kilometers per hour, temperature swings of over 200 degrees in a matter of hours, and precipitation that ranges from acidic compounds to metallic particulates." "Outstanding, sir. What about the local wildlife?" This question seemed to perplex every other species in the hall, but had spent enough time around humans to recognize the pattern. The fauna includes numerous apex predators, venomous species, and creatures that have evolved to thrive in the planet's hostile conditions. The largest recorded specimens are comparable to your Earth's prehistoric megafauna. From the human section came a sound that made every other species turn to stare. Jake Adams was actually chuckling. "Sorry, sir," Adams said, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect hall. This sounds like the kind of place my great-grandfather would have tried to hunt deer." The reaction from the other cadets was immediate and varied. The Etherians looked horrified at the concept of voluntarily seeking out dangerous predators. The chittering took on a pitch that indicated complete bewilderment. The aquatic species made sounds that roughly translated to, "These humans are completely insane." But something interesting was happening in the human section. Instead of the fear and despair that was radiating from every other group, the humans were beginning to look excited. "Cadet Adams," said, recognizing an opportunity when he saw one, "would you care to share your assessment of our deployment scenario?" Jake stood up, his movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the hall. At his full height, he was taller than most of the other species' representatives, but it wasn't his physical presence that commanded attention. It was the complete absence of fear in his demeanor. "Well, sir," Jake began, his voice taking on the conversational tone that humans seem to use regardless of circumstances. "The way I see it, we've got a planet that doesn't want us there, an enemy that doesn't think we can survive there, and 2 million of the galaxy's finest cadets who've been training for exactly this kind of challenge." He paused, looking around the hall with the kind of casual confidence that made other species nervous. "The hegemony forces are expecting to fight Federation military doctrine, organized formations, standardized tactics, predictable responses to hostile conditions. They're not expecting to deal with someone who looks at it and thinks, camping opportunity." From somewhere else in the human section came another voice. "Sir, are we talking about the kind of where the environment is actively trying to kill you, or just the kind where everything else is trying to kill you?" "Both, Cadet Morgan." "Sweet, haven't had a good challenge like that since survival training on Titan." The non-human cadets were beginning to look at the humans with something approaching disbelief. The concept of finding entertainment value in mortal peril seemed to be fundamentally incompatible with their psychological frameworks. A tentative voice came from the Etherian section. "Commander, surely there must be some mistake. Class 3 are barely habitable even with full environmental protection. How can we possibly establish a military base under such conditions?" Before could answer, Jake Adams spoke up again. "Ma'am, with respect, I think you might be approaching this from the wrong angle. See, humans don't really think about making hostile environments comfortable. We think about making hostile environments work for us." He gestured toward the displays showing 438B's environmental data. Those windstorms, perfect cover for movement and natural camouflage for equipment signatures. The temperature variations. Any enemy force is going to be dealing with the same conditions, except we'll have had time to adapt and they won't. The dangerous fauna. Well, if something's big enough to hunt hegemony soldiers, it's probably smart enough to learn that we're not the ones shooting at it. From the section came a series of clicks that roughly translated to, "This species has no survival instinct whatsoever." "Actually," said another human voice, a female cadet whose file remembered as being from Earth's Australian continent, which was apparently considered hazardous even by human standards. "I think the real advantage is that the hegemony has no idea how humans handle extreme environments." "Explain that assessment," Cadet said. "Well, sir, most species adapt to hostile conditions by developing specialized equipment or biological modifications. Humans adapt by getting used to everything trying to kill us, and then figuring out how to kill it back." His grin was visible even from his position at the podium. "Plus, if I'm reading these environmental reports correctly, 438B has weather patterns that are actually more predictable than Queensland during cyclone season." The conversation was taking on a momentum that hadn't expected, but found himself reluctant to interrupt. The human cadets were displaying exactly the kind of confidence that military psychologists had identified as crucial for mission success, while simultaneously terrifying every other species in the hall with their casual attitude toward mortal peril. "Commander," came a voice from the crystalline resonant section, vibrating with harmonics that indicated deep concern. "Surely you don't expect us to adopt human tactical approaches. Our physiological requirements are completely incompatible with environments." This seemed to catch Jake Adams' attention. "Actually, sir, I think that's where we might have an advantage. The hegemony is probably expecting us to fail because they're thinking about this like a conventional military deployment. But what if we don't try to fight the environment?" "Continue, Adams." "What if we use it? Every species here has evolved different advantages. The Etherians can fly, which means they can scout from positions that ground-based enemies can't reach. The aquatic species can operate in any water sources on the planet without life support. The crystalline species can process electromagnetic data that the rest of us can't even detect." Jake's enthusiasm was becoming infectious, at least among the humans. Other species were beginning to look intrigued despite their fear. "The key isn't making everyone fight like humans, sir. The key is making the environment work against the hegemony instead of against us. They're expecting to fight a conventional military force. Instead, they're going to face something that treats a Class 3 like home field advantage." The hall had become surprisingly quiet, with even the most nervous species listening to Adams' impromptu tactical briefing. Realized that without intending to, the human cadet was doing something that months of military psychology courses hadn't managed. He was making the deployment sound not just survivable, but winnable. "Cadet Adams," said, "you seem remarkably confident about our chances against an enemy force that has already defeated veteran Federation units." Jake's response came without hesitation. "Sir, with respect, those veteran units were fighting on worlds where the environment was neutral. On 438B, the environment is going to be on our side because we'll be the ones who know how to use it." From somewhere in the crowd came a voice that didn't immediately identify. "So basically, we're going camping with weapons and really interesting wildlife." The human response was immediate and unanimous. "Exactly." And that was the moment when realized that the Federation's most desperate gamble might actually have a chance of success. The transport ship Determination shuddered as it entered the outer atmosphere of 438B, its hull groaning under stresses that would have torn apart most civilian vessels. Commander stood in the observation deck, watching through reinforced as his carefully planned deployment descended into what could only be described as controlled chaos. The first sign that things were not going according to standard military protocol came when Jake Adams pressed his face against the nearest viewport and let out a sound that could only be described as delighted laughter. "Oh, this is going to be fun," Adams said, watching as massive electrical storms danced across the planet's surface like some cosmic light show. "Look at the size of those lightning strikes." Beside him, Cadet was taking readings on a handheld scanner, her expression showing the kind of focused excitement that had learned to associate with humans encountering new forms of potential danger. "Atmospheric pressure is about 3 times Earth standard," she reported to the cluster of human cadets that had gathered around the viewports. "Temperature at the landing site is currently -40°C, but the thermal scans show it could spike to +60 within the next few hours." From the Etherian section of the transport came a series of melodic tones that roughly translated to, "We are all going to die horribly." "Actually," said another human voice, "Cadet, if memory served correctly, those pressure differentials are going to create some really interesting wind patterns. We might be able to use them for tactical movement." The non-human cadets were handling the approach to 438B with varying degrees of psychological fortitude. The aquatic depth swimmers had sealed themselves into their mobile environment suits and were making the subsonic humming sounds that indicated either prayer or preparation for death, possibly both. The crystalline resonants were vibrating at frequencies that caused uncomfortable harmonics throughout the ship's hull. Even the usually stoic species were showing signs of stress. The humans, meanwhile, were treating the descent like some kind of extreme sports expedition. "Hey, Adams," called out Cadet Murphy from across the observation deck. "Remember that survival exercise we did on Io last semester? The one where the instructors thought they were being mean by dropping us in the sulfur plains during storm season?" Adams grinned. "Good times. This should be similar, except with more interesting weather and better scenery." Lieutenant, who had been assigned as aide for the deployment, approached with her tablet displaying the latest environmental updates. Her plant-like physiology was showing stress patterns, leaves curling inward and her natural bioluminescence flickering erratically. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the musical undertones that indicated barely controlled panic, "the landing zone atmospheric readings are becoming increasingly unstable. Perhaps we should consider delaying the deployment until conditions improve." Before could respond, Jake Adams turned from his position at the viewport. "Ma'am, with respect, conditions on don't really improve, they just change to different kinds of dangerous," he said. "Besides, unstable atmospheric conditions are actually tactical advantages if you know how to use them." Sleeves rustled in confusion. How can atmospheric instability be considered advantageous? "Well," Adams said, warming to the subject in the way humans did when discussing things that should have been terrifying, "unpredictable weather makes it really hard for enemy forces to maintain communication networks, coordinate movements, or use standard surveillance equipment. Plus, if you time your operations right, you can use storm fronts as natural cover for large-scale troop movements." From the section came a series of clicks that's translator rendered as, "These humans interpret tactical disadvantages as strategic opportunities. This is either brilliant or completely insane." The ship's captain, a veteran officer named whose species had evolved in high-pressure environments, announced over the comm system that they were beginning final approach to the Federation research station that would serve as their base of operations. Through the viewports, the surface of 438B began to resolve into distinct geographical features, and felt his optimism wavering. The planet looked like someone had taken the worst aspects of every hostile environment in the galaxy and combined them into a single world. Massive mountain ranges thrust up through perpetual storm clouds, their peaks shrouded in what the sensors indicated were clouds of metallic particles suspended in near-vacuum atmospheric conditions. Between the mountains, vast valleys filled with what appeared to be organic matter stretched toward horizons that flickered with electrical discharges. The research station itself was a testament to Federation engineering, a cluster of reinforced structures built into the side of a cliff face, designed to withstand the planet's hostile conditions while providing a secure base of operations. It looked tiny against the vast, angry landscape surrounding it. Now that, said Adams, studying the view with obvious appreciation, is what I call a defensible position. Cadet Adams, said, approaching the human group, I'm curious about your assessment of our tactical situation. Adams gestured toward the viewport, where the research station was becoming larger as they approached. Well, sir, the good news is that anyone trying to attack that position is going to have to deal with the same environmental conditions that we are, except they won't have had time to adapt or prepare. The bad news is that the same environmental conditions are going to make logistics and communication challenging for us too. And your recommendation for managing those challenges? Honestly, sir, stop thinking like Federation military doctrine and start thinking well, like people who grew up places where the environment has a personal vendetta against you. This comment drew attention from several of the non-human cadets, who seemed to be developing a morbid fascination with human tactical philosophy. A tentative voice came from the Etherian section. Cadet Adams, could you explain what you mean by environmental vendetta? Adams turned to address the speaker, a delicate-looking Etherian whose gossamer wings were folded tightly against her body in a gesture that indicated extreme nervousness. Well, Cadet Ra, back on Earth, we have this concept called hostile environment survival, which is basically learning to live in places that are actively trying to kill you. The trick isn't to fight the environment. That's a losing battle. The trick is to understand how the environment works and then use that knowledge to your advantage. But how can an environment that threatens your survival be advantageous? Asked another Etherian. Because, said, joining the conversation, if the environment is equally hostile to everyone, then whoever adapts best has the advantage. And humans are really, really good at adapting to things that want to kill us. The transport ship settled onto the landing platform with a series of mechanical groans that spoke to the stress the planet's atmospheric conditions were placing on its systems. Through the viewports, could see the research station's personnel emerging to greet them, all wearing heavy environmental suits that made them look like walking equipment lockers. Attention all cadets, came the captain's voice over the comm system. Environmental suits are mandatory for all non-species. Atmospheric conditions are within acceptable parameters for Class 3 adapted species, but all others should expect significant physiological stress without proper protection. The announcement triggered a flurry of activity as different species began donning their respective environmental protection systems. The Etherian suits were gossamer light affairs that provided atmospheric regulation while maintaining their natural agility. The aquatic species sealed themselves into mobile aquarium suits that allowed them to move on land while maintaining their required moisture levels. The crystalline species required electromagnetic shielding that made them look like walking sculptures wrapped in metallic fabric. The humans, meanwhile, simply put on what appeared to be slightly heavier versions of their standard uniforms and checked their equipment. That's it, asked a resonant cadet, his harmonic voice wavering with disbelief. No environmental suits, no atmospheric processing equipment. Earth is a Class 3, Adams explained cheerfully. We're basically built for this kind of thing, though I might grab a jacket if the temperature drops below -50, that starts to get uncomfortable after a few hours. The cargo bay doors opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and 438B's atmosphere rolled into the ship like a living thing. Most of the non-human cadets immediately sealed their suits and began breathing recycled air. The humans took deep breaths, and several of them commented on how fresh the air smelled. All right, everyone, announced, welcome to our new home. Remember, we're here to establish a forward operating base and prepare defensive positions against hegemony forces. This is not a training exercise. As they disembarked onto the planet's surface, the full reality of their situation became apparent. The gravity was slightly higher than galactic standard, making every step feel heavier than expected. The air carried a metallic taste and moved with winds that seemed to have their own agenda. In the distance, massive lightning strikes illuminated landscape features that looked like they had been designed by someone with a deeply malicious sense of aesthetics. The research station's commanding officer, Major Eth, approached their group with the purposeful stride of someone who had learned to move efficiently in hostile environments. His species, the, had evolved on a world of perpetual twilight and chemical storms, making them one of the few non-human species that could function reasonably well on Class 3. Commander, Major Eth said, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind, "Welcome to paradise." The way he said paradise suggested it was the station's unofficial name, delivered with the kind of gallows humor that military personnel developed in extreme situations. Major replied, "Status report on our defensive capabilities. The research station has been converted into a fortified position, but our defensive perimeter is limited by the terrain and atmospheric conditions. We can hold against conventional assault, but the hegemony forces have been using some unconventional tactics." As they walked toward the station's main entrance, Jake Adams was studying the surrounding landscape with obvious interest. "Major, what kind of unconventional tactics?" Eth turned to look at the human cadet and could see the moment when the major registered that Adams was not wearing an environmental suit despite the planet's hostile conditions. "They've been using the local fauna as biological weapons," Eth said slowly. 438B's predator species are aggressive, and the hegemony has developed methods for directing that aggression toward Federation positions. "Oh, that's clever," Adams said with genuine appreciation. "What kind of predators are we talking about?" "The largest specimens are comparable to Earth's prehistoric megafauna, but they've evolved hunting strategies that take advantage of the planet's environmental extremes. They can survive in near-vacuum conditions, they're resistant to electrical discharge, and they're intelligent enough to use pack tactics." Adam's grin was becoming downright predatory. "So we're talking about smart, durable, aggressive pack hunters that are adapted to extreme environments." "That's correct." "Outstanding. Those sound like exactly the kind of creatures that might be interested in learning about new prey species, like, say, hegemony soldiers who don't belong here." The non-human cadets were beginning to look at Adams with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright concern. The idea of intentionally attracting the attention of dangerous predators seemed to violate every survival instinct known to galactic civilization. Major Eth, however, was looking at Adams with something that might have been professional interest. "Cadet, are you suggesting we attempt to redirect the local fauna's aggression?" "I'm suggesting we stop thinking like prey and start thinking like apex predators who just moved into someone else's territory," Adams replied. "See, the thing about pack hunters is that they're smart enough to recognize other predators, and they're social enough to understand territorial boundaries." They had reached the station's main entrance, where the reinforced doors hissed open to reveal a bustling hub of activity. Federation personnel were converting research labs into command centers, setting up communication arrays, and establishing supply chains, all the complex logistics necessary to transform a scientific outpost into a military base. "Major," said as they entered the relative shelter of the station, "how much time do we have before hegemony forces reach this sector?" "Our best intelligence estimates put their advance forces about 72 hours out, with main battle groups following within the week." "And our current defensive capabilities?" "Standard Federation fortifications, adapted for conditions. We can hold against light assault forces, but anything more substantial." Eth's gesture suggested the outcome would be unpleasant. It was then that Jake Adams did something that would later become legendary in Federation military circles. He looked around the converted research station, studied the tactical displays showing hegemony force movements, considered the environmental data streaming in from 438B's monitoring systems, and started laughing. Not the bitter laughter of despair or the manic laughter of someone who had snapped under pressure, but the genuine, delighted laughter of someone who had just realized that their opponents had made a fundamental strategic error. "Cadet Adams," said carefully, "care to share what you find amusing about our tactical situation?" "Sir," Adams said, his laughter subsiding into the kind of grin that made other species nervous, "I don't think the hegemony understands what they're about to walk into." "Explain." Adams gestured toward the tactical displays. "They're treating this like a standard military engagement. Secure the target, establish control, move on to the next objective. But they're doing it on a Class 3 where the environment itself is a weapon system." He pointed to the environmental monitoring data. "Look at these atmospheric patterns. We've got storm fronts that can disable communications, electromagnetic anomalies that mess with navigation systems, and temperature fluctuations that can stress military equipment beyond operational parameters." The assembled command staff, was beginning to pay attention to Adams' impromptu briefing. Now add in local fauna that's evolved to hunt in these conditions, terrain that channels movement into predictable patterns, and 2 million Federation cadets who just spent the last 3 months learning to think of impossible situations as training opportunities. Adams' grin widened. "Sir, I don't think we're the ones in trouble here. I think the hegemony just walked into the galaxy's most elaborate trap, and they don't even know it yet." Major Eth was studying Adams with the expression of someone trying to determine if he was listening to brilliance or madness. "Cadet, you're suggesting we use the planet itself as a defensive system." "I'm suggesting we stop thinking defensively and start thinking like predators who know this territory better than anyone else," Adams replied. "The hegemony expects us to hunker down and wait for rescue. Instead, we're going to teach them why humans consider Class 3 character-building experiences." From somewhere in the crowd of cadets came a voice that summed up what everyone was thinking. "So we're not just surviving this deployment, we're turning it into the hegemony's worst nightmare." Jake Adams' response would later be quoted in military academies throughout Federation space. "Exactly. Welcome to spring break, everybody. Let's show these invaders how humans party." The command center had been hastily converted from what was once the station's primary research lab, and the juxtaposition of civilian scientific equipment with military tactical displays created an atmosphere that was somehow both chaotic and purposeful. Commander found himself studying readouts that painted an increasingly complex picture of their situation. The hegemony advanced scouts had been detected at the edge of the system, their movement patterns suggesting a methodical approach that spoke to professional military planning. They were taking their time, establishing supply lines and communication networks as they advanced, exactly the kind of thorough, by-the-book strategy that had served them well in their previous victories against Federation forces. What they weren't accounting for was Jake Adams standing in front of a holographic projection of 438B's topology, pointing out features with the enthusiasm of someone planning an elaborate practical joke. "Major Eth," Adams was saying, "these canyon systems here and here, what's the atmospheric flow pattern through them during storm season?" The Major consulted his environmental database. Severe wind tunneling with velocities exceeding 600 kilometers per hour. The electromagnetic interference makes them essentially communication dead zones. Perfect, and these plateau regions. Temperature extremes. The thermal differential between day and night cycles can exceed 300 degrees. Adams nodded with satisfaction. So if someone were to, say, position themselves in these canyons during a storm front, they'd be effectively invisible to standard sensors. And if they timed their movements with the thermal cycles on the plateaus, they could move large groups without being detected by heat signature scanners. The assembled command staff was beginning to understand that Adams wasn't just studying the terrain. He was developing what appeared to be a comprehensive strategy for turning 438B's hostility into a tactical advantage. "Cadet Adams," said, "you seem to be developing a rather ambitious operational plan." "Yes, sir. See, the hegemony is expecting to fight Federation military doctrine, which means they're prepared for conventional defensive positions, standard communication protocols, and predictable tactical responses." Adams gestured toward the holographic display. "But they're not prepared for an enemy that treats environmental hazards as tactical opportunities." Lieutenant, who had been monitoring communications with the various cadet units as they settled into their new quarters, approached with an expression that seemed to combine confusion with grudging admiration. "Commander," she said, "I'm receiving reports from the unit commanders. The human cadets have begun reorganizing their equipment." "In what way?" "They're trading standard environmental protection gear for what they're calling local adaptation equipment. They've also requested access to the station's fabrication facilities to modify their weapons systems." Felt a familiar twinge of concern. Human creativity applied to military equipment had a tendency to produce results that were either brilliant or catastrophic, with little middle ground. "What kind of modifications?" "They want to recalibrate their energy weapons for effectiveness in high electromagnetic interference environments, and they're requesting materials to construct what they're calling environmental utility devices." Major Eth looked up from his tactical planning. What exactly is an environmental utility device? According to Cadet Adams' requisition request, said, consulting her tablet, devices designed to enhance the natural defensive capabilities of local environmental conditions. He's also requested detailed information about the feeding and migration patterns of the local predator species. The Major's expression shifted to something that might have been alarm. Cadet Adams, you're not planning to interact with the local fauna, are you? Adams' grin suggested that interaction was exactly what he had in mind. Major, with respect, I think we've been approaching this all wrong. Everyone's been so focused on how dangerous the local wildlife is that nobody's considered how useful they might be. The predator species on this planet have evolved to kill anything that moves through their territory, Eth said carefully. They're not pets or allies, they're apex predators that consider everything else food. Exactly, Adams said, as if the Major had just made his point for him. And what do apex predators do when someone else's prey animals wander into their territory? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when a group of military professionals suddenly realizes they're listening to either genius or madness, and they're not sure which. Cadet Adams said slowly, are you suggesting we use 438B's predator species as an early warning system? I'm suggesting we use them as a comprehensive area denial system, Adams replied. See, the hegemony forces are going to move through this terrain assuming they're the most dangerous thing in the environment. But they're wrong. They're not predators here, they're invasive species. From the crowd of assembled cadets came a voice that recognized as belonging to. And what happens to invasive species that move into territory belonging to established apex predators? They get eaten, Adams said cheerfully, usually very thoroughly. The non-human cadets were looking increasingly concerned about the direction this conversation was taking, but noticed that the human contingent was nodding along with Adams' reasoning as if it made perfect sense. Major, Adams continued, what's the typical hunting pattern for the local megafauna? Eth consulted his database again. They're ambush predators that use the terrain and atmospheric conditions to conceal their approach. They typically hunt in coordinated groups and are capable of sustained pursuit across difficult terrain. And their territorial behavior. Highly aggressive toward intruders. They mark territory using scent markers and electromagnetic signatures that can be detected at considerable distances. Adams nodded with satisfaction. So if someone were to, hypothetically, learn to recognize and respect those territorial markers, they might be able to move through predator territory without triggering aggressive responses. Theoretically, yes, but... And if someone were to, again hypothetically, observe the hunting patterns and territorial boundaries, they might be able to predict where predators would be most likely to encounter unwelcome intruders. The Major was beginning to look like someone who could see the shape of Adams' plan and wasn't entirely comfortable with its implications. Cadet Adams, you're talking about turning this planet's ecosystem into a weapons system. I'm talking about working with the ecosystem instead of against it, Adams corrected. The hegemony is going to try to impose their will on this environment. We're going to become part of it. Commander found himself studying the tactical displays with new eyes. If Adams was right, if they could truly adapt to 438B's conditions rather than simply endure them, then their situation might be less desperate than it appeared. Adams, he said, assuming your assessment is correct, what would be your recommended course of action? First, we stop trying to make this place comfortable and start learning to use its natural advantages. Second, we establish observation posts that monitor both hegemony movements and predator activity patterns. Third, we modify our equipment and tactics to work with environmental conditions instead of against them. Adams paused, then added with the kind of grin that made career military officers nervous. And fourth, we teach the hegemony forces that there are worse things on this planet than Federation cadets. From somewhere in the assembled crowd came a question that would later be remembered as the moment when the deployment officially stopped being a desperate defensive action and became something unprecedented in Federation military history. So basically, we're turning a Class 3 into the galaxy's most elaborate training exercise. Jake Adams' response was delivered with the casual confidence that would soon make him legendary throughout the Federation military. Not a training exercise. a graduation exam, and the Hegemony just volunteered to be our final project. The first Hegemony scout ships entered 438B's system exactly 71 hours after the Federation cadets had established their base of operations, and their initial reconnaissance reports would later become required reading in military academies across 3 galactic sectors, primarily as examples of how catastrophically wrong intelligence assessments could go. Colonel of the Hegemony stood in the command center of his flagship, studying the preliminary scans of the Federation research station with the satisfaction of a professional soldier who had found his enemy exactly where intelligence reports had predicted they would be. The orbital surveys showed a standard defensive perimeter, regulation communication arrays, and all the hallmarks of a hastily fortified position manned by troops who were clearly out of their depth. "Pathetic," he muttered to his aide, a young whose warrior marks indicated recent graduation from their military academies. High Command was concerned about a few thousand cadets hiding. The aide consulted his tactical display. "Sir, the Federation deployment appears to be significantly larger than initial estimates suggested. We're detecting approximately 2 million life signs concentrated around the research facility." His mandibles clicked together in what his species considered laughter. "Even better, they've concentrated their forces in a single, easily targeted location. This will be over before the main battle group even arrives." What neither Colonel nor his intelligence analysts knew was that the easily targeted location was actually functioning as the central hub of the most complex asymmetric warfare operation in Federation history, coordinated by cadets who had spent the past 3 days learning to think like 438B's apex predators. In the converted research station, Jake Adams stood before a 3-dimensional holographic map that showed Hegemony ship movements, local weather patterns, predator migration routes, and the positions of Federation units scattered across half a continent. The display looked like someone had tried to create a tactical planning system while under the influence of hallucinogens, but Adams was reading it with the focused attention of someone who understood every data point. "Hegemony advanced scouts just entered the system," reported Cadet from her position at the communication console. "They're maintaining standard approach vectors and conducting preliminary orbital surveys." "Perfect," Adams said, his tone suggesting that the arrival of enemy forces was exactly what he had been hoping for. "Any indication they've detected our distributed units?" "Negative. They appear to be focusing their scans on the research station and immediate vicinity." Commander, who had spent the past 3 days watching his carefully planned deployment transform into something that conventional military categorization, approached the tactical display with the expression of someone who had stopped trying to understand what was happening and was simply hoping it would continue to work. "Adams, status report on our unconventional assets." Jake gestured toward a series of markers scattered across the holographic terrain map. "Observation teams are in position along all major approach routes. They've identified and marked predator territorial boundaries, established communication protocols that work within electromagnetic interference zones, and learned to recognize the warning signs for incoming storm fronts." He pointed to another set of markers. "The engineering teams have completed modifications to our equipment. All energy weapons are now calibrated for high-interference environments, and we've successfully field-tested the environmental utility devices." Decided he probably didn't want to know what environmental utility devices actually did, but he asked anyway. "Devices that enhance natural atmospheric phenomena," Adams explained cheerfully. "For example, we can now trigger localized electromagnetic pulses during storm conditions, create controlled avalanches in unstable geological areas, and generate acoustic signals that mimic territorial markers of local predator species." "You can what?" Major Eth said, looking up from his own tactical display. "We can make ourselves sound like really big, really aggressive predators to anything that doesn't know better," Adams clarified. "It turns out 438B's megafauna communicate using subsonic vocalizations that our modified equipment can reproduce. To local predators, a properly calibrated acoustic beacon sounds like a territorial warning from something much larger and more dangerous than they want to fight. And to hegemony forces, it just sounds like weird planetary background noise. Right up until the local wildlife decides to investigate why strange new prey animals are making sounds in someone else's territory." The implications of this were beginning to sink in among the command staff. Lieutenant, whose plant-based physiology had adapted remarkably well to 438B's conditions, approached with a communication tablet that was displaying intercepts from Hegemony Fleet Communications. Commander, we're receiving intelligence updates from our distributed observation posts. The Hegemony Advance Force consists of approximately 50 vessels, with main battle groups scheduled to arrive within 6 standard days. What's their planned approach strategy? Asked. Standard orbital bombardment followed by ground assault, replied. They're planning to neutralize the research station and establish a forward base for operations against core Federation worlds. Jake Adams studied this information with obvious interest. Orbital bombardment, you say? That's going to create some really interesting atmospheric disturbances. Major Eth was beginning to recognize the pattern of human tactical thinking. Cadet Adams, please tell me you're not planning to use orbital bombardment as a tactical advantage. Actually, Major, I'm planning to use it as a strategic advantage, Adams replied. See, 438B has some unique atmospheric properties that make orbital bombardment a really complicated proposition. He gestured toward the environmental monitoring displays. The electromagnetic interference patterns mean that precision targeting is nearly impossible. The atmospheric density variations cause unpredictable trajectory alterations for energy weapons, and the storm systems can actually redirect plasma discharges in ways that no targeting computer can compensate for. Meaning that when the Hegemony tries orbital bombardment, they're going to end up hitting random locations across half the continent, including some places where the local wildlife is not going to appreciate the interruption. The assembled command staff was beginning to understand that Adams had spent the past 3 days not just adapting to 438B's conditions, but learning to weaponize them. Adams, Commander said carefully, exactly how much of this planet's ecosystem have you managed to incorporate into our defensive strategy? Well, sir, let's just say that the Hegemony is about to discover why the Federation classified this world as unsuitable for military operations. At that moment, Cadet's voice came through the communication system from his observation post in the northern canyons. Command, this is Observation Post 7. We have visual on Hegemony landing craft beginning atmospheric entry. They're using standard assault vectors and appear to be targeting the research station's immediate vicinity. Copy that, 7, Adams replied. Are you positioned to observe their landing zone? Affirmative. They're coming down in the thermal plains, about 15 kilometers from your position. Adams grinned. The thermal plains? Perfect. What's the current atmospheric conditions in that area? Consulted her environmental monitoring systems. Temperature differential is currently sitting at about 200 degrees between surface and 30 meters elevation. Electromagnetic activity is moderate but increasing. And, she paused, checking another reading, the geological sensors are detecting subsonic vibrations consistent with megafauna movement patterns. Outstanding, Adams said, his enthusiasm causing several non-human cadets to edge away from him nervously. Maintain visual contact and report on Hegemony ground force deployment. Yes, sir. You might want to find a comfortable position to watch from. This is going to be educational. What happened next would later be analyzed in military colleges throughout known space as a perfect example of how environmental factors could completely overwhelm technological superiority. The Hegemony landing craft touched down in the thermal plains with textbook precision, their pilots confident in their ability to establish a secure beachhead from which to launch their assault on the Federation position. The first wave consisted of approximately 2,000 soldiers equipped with standard assault gear and supported by mobile artillery platforms designed for rapid deployment operations. What they found was a landscape that seemed designed by someone with a deeply malicious sense of humor. The thermal plains existed in a state of perpetual atmospheric chaos, where superheated air rose from geothermal vents to create thermal columns that could lift a fully armored soldier 30 meters into the air without warning. The electromagnetic fields generated by the planet's unique mineral compositions interfered with communication equipment, navigation systems, and weapon targeting computers, and the subsonic vibrations that had detected were growing stronger by the minute. Colonel, monitoring the operation from orbit, watched his carefully planned assault begin to encounter complications almost immediately. "Ground Force Commander, report," he ordered. The response came through heavy static interference. "Sir, we're experiencing significant environmental difficulties. Equipment is malfunctioning, communication is sporadic, and the terrain is more challenging than anticipated." "Adapt and overcome, Commander. This is we expected hostile conditions." What neither the colonel nor his ground commander expected was for those hostile conditions to suddenly become mobile. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when seismic sensors began detecting massive movement signatures approaching the hegemony landing zone from multiple directions. The second indication was when the acoustic monitoring equipment registered subsonic vocalizations that were definitely not geological in origin. The third indication was when something the size of a Federation cruiser and considerably more aggressive emerged from a thermal vent and decided that the strange new metal objects in its territory looked like a threat that needed to be eliminated immediately. From his observation post, provided a running commentary that would later become legendary among Federation forces. "Command, the hegemony just met the locals. I count at least 6 megafauna specimens converging on their landing zone. The lead creature appears to be, well, it's really big, and it seems to have taken exception to their presence." "Define really big," Adams requested. "Sir, it's approximately the size of a small building, has more teeth than anything has a right to, and it just picked up one of their armored vehicles like it was a particularly interesting snack." The hegemony ground forces, to their credit, responded with professional military efficiency. They established defensive positions, called for orbital support, and began engaging the local fauna with weapons designed to stop conventional military forces. Unfortunately for them, 438B's megafauna had not evolved according to conventional military parameters. "Are the hegemony weapons having any effect on the local wildlife?" "Negative, Command. Their energy weapons appear to be energizing the creatures rather than damaging them. The megafauna seem to be absorbing electromagnetic energy and converting it to increased metabolic activity." "They're getting stronger when shot?" Major Eth asked incredulously. "That would be consistent with their evolutionary adaptation to this environment," Adams said thoughtfully. "These creatures evolved in conditions of constant electromagnetic bombardment from the planet's storm systems. They probably developed the ability to metabolize electromagnetic energy as a survival trait." The communication channel crackled as continued his report. "Command, the hegemony forces are requesting immediate orbital bombardment support. They appear to be, well, they